Hour 2 of the Bold Republic Radio Show. My name's Glenn Woods, and joining me finally live in studio for the first time, it's about time, Maureen Bader from Wyoming Liberty Group, who was just in Buffalo, Wyoming. And we're going to do this first and up front for the record. I dared you. Show the camera. She paid up. There it is. My lawyer says that I don't have to pay all of the interest. He cost me $250. So if you want to go ahead and for a multi-million-dollar fight over whether I owe you interest on that or not, there was a dare. You did it. You're good. We're safe.
No interest. But what about my interest? That was months ago.
Supposed to be, was it $20 or something like that? So, okay, you were in Buffalo, Wyoming, and was this at the Occidental Hotel, or did you go somewhere else for the?
No, so we had the Revenue Committee was meeting at at one other hotel there.
Okay.
And no, we weren't at the Occidental Hotel, unfortunately, and I didn't stay there either. But in hindsight,
you know, yeah, I've had a chance to stay there, and you want to stay at some point at the Occidental Hotel if you never have. Well, but do they take cats?
Well, this was the other thing.
Yeah,
this was the other thing. So one of the Revenue Committee met over 2 days, and they were talking about a couple of things yesterday. One of them was the sales tax exemptions,
right? And
the other was where does the money to fund local governments come from? So that was yesterday's discussion. But what I was most interested in was the econometric analysis that a foundation did for the government to lay out what the revenue volatility is and how big then should the rainy day fund be to cover off,
let's translate this into English for the people out there who are the average Joe driving down the road in their pickup truck. In other words, Wyoming takes in money that it uses to run the state of Wyoming. And some of it comes from taxes, but some of it comes from oil, gas, and
that's
so on.
Taxes too.
Taxes too, right? And that money goes into not only what they're going to spend. Is that the general fund?
Right.
Okay, but then the rainy day fund is the just in case.
That's an easy way to put it, yeah.
Just in case what?
Well, see, now this was one of the very interesting things that came up. Now, the Pew Foundation, just for some background, is a nonprofit organization. It benefits from, I think it's something like 7 funds that were originally put together by the Sun Oil family, the Pews. Right. So they now do a lot of work to try to make sure that the states and other things, and the federal government also, and people in general, are basing their decisions on rigorous analysis using a lot of data. So now in the past, the Pew Foundation has actually done some studies related to revenue volatility, and I think that's partly the reason, besides the fact that they would do it for free, that the state or the Legislative Service Office here in Wyoming asked the Pew Foundation to do an analysis specifically for Wyoming.
Right.
Now, some of those are in permanent accounts, so those can't be touched unless we have a constitutional amendment. And other ones are a little bit like checking accounts. And the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account, or the Rainy Day Fund, is one of those. Now, right now, that fund only has about 1.8 billion in it. Part of the reason it didn't go to over 2 billion for this year is because last year, to cover off the deficit, what the Joint Appropriations Committee and the legislature did was divert some of the funds that would have gone into the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account to cover off the deficit, so that the governor could keep on pretty much spending whatever it is they want.
Before we get into the details of your meeting here, I didn't know that Wyoming had a deficit. Where did the deficit come from? Why did they have to suddenly shift money? Because they're supposed to balance that budget.
Well, right. So I think what people need to understand is that when the government spends money, or when the government decides how much it's going to spend, it's basing that on what it thinks it's going to have,
right,
not on what it actually has. So revenue coming in, not revenue that's already saved up. Now, there are some legislators who have been talking about changing the process so that the state is spending what it actually has in hand instead of what it thinks it has.
Right.
So, but that's not what it's like now. So back in last October, the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account and, well, the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group, there's just too many acronyms here.
Yeah.
It's a group that does this forecasting. What it realized back last October was that the amount of money that the government thought it was going to be able to spend in the in fiscal year 2016 was in fact $222 million short. So they had to come up with that money to pay off all this planned spending that they had with the planned revenue now that they didn't have.
Okay, and the thought just never occurs to these folks maybe just to go ahead and spend a whole lot less, but that's a whole nother story.
Oh my goodness, no.
Let's not go there. Okay, so this is where we have to translate, because I was looking at the notes that you sent me, and I thought, boy, this gets kind of complicated here. Okay, so let's start with the point is what when they started the meeting? What is the purpose and the point of this meeting?
So one of the things that came up in the last session was, gee, we're in a downturn, we should spend this money. But the thing with the rainy day fund is that no one has ever said, and it's never been defined in legislation, what is a rainy day?
Yeah.
What are the rules around how are we going to spend it? What are the rules around how we're going to take money out of it? Because that fund was actually set up in 2005. No money has ever been withdrawn. Now, as I said, money has been diverted out. So there was money that never went in, that should have gone in, but didn't. Right. But no money has ever been withdrawn from that account. Because in part, really, part of the reason it was set up, and one of the things that you'll hear a lot when you listen to the politicians and bureaucrats talk, or the governor, they talk about coffee cans. Well, we've got this money in this coffee can, we've got this money in that coffee can. What they're referring to is one of these hundreds of accounts that they have. They get made up sort of on the fly every once in a while, because what a lot of, especially the fiscal conservatives, are trying to do is keep that money out of the hands of the spendthrifts.
Okay, so what then what was the message that they were delivering during this meeting?
The main message, well, in fact, the main message is that what the legislature has to do is make those decisions. They need to decide what is the level of coverage that they want the rainy day fund to have. So in other words, do you want your rainy day fund to cover off 10% of the shortage, or 90% of the shortage, or 50% of what number do you want? And then the other thing they want to do is there was a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Well, and again, to translate some of this stuff, so because you're into this. This is something that you study, but most people listen to you, and it's like listening to a scientist talking physics at sometimes. But anyway, you found one.
Yeah, and the other thing is the length or the duration of the downturn.
Yeah.
So one of the things they did in the study was say, okay, because they didn't actually have a lot of things defined, like for instance, why are you actually saving instead of spending? Of course, we know why they're saving instead of spending, and that's because they're trying not to get the government too big. Believe it or not, there are a lot of fiscal conservatives in the government, and they're doing their best to keep the spenders under control.
Well, if they've been in Wyoming long enough, they know the boom bust cycle, so they know to put away.
And the other thing, of course, is what is really the purpose of the legislative stabilization reserve account. That has never actually been defined. Everybody talks about a rainy day and all this, but as we said before, what is a rainy day? And when I was talking to legislators at the end of the meeting, they were all saying, well, one of them said, well, I think a rainy day is when the federal government stops sending us money, because that is going to happen one of these days.
Who was that jerk? I want his name. I want to know who that guy was.
No, that was Mark Jennings.
That was it. Yeah, okay, that figures.
And then another one was, he also said, well, another example of a rainy day would be a big natural catastrophe.
Right.
So you have a sudden and unexpected something that happens, and suddenly you just don't have the kind of money that you thought. And that, in fact, the governor has actually said that it was for a sudden and unexpected downturn.
Right.
Now, there are other legislators who say things, who I spoke to, who say, a couple of senators said, well, we're not in a rainy day now. This isn't a rainy day. It certainly wasn't unexpected, because I mentioned at the beginning, we've been talking about this recession or this downturn or these deficits since last October. So this is not sudden and unexpected. So those are the sorts of things, and then a couple of the other things were what's your duration of coverage? So that was one of the things that they modeled out in this big econometric analysis, where they said, okay, if you have a sudden and unexpected occurrence and suddenly your revenue drops, how much of that do you actually want to be able to cover, and for how long? And so what they did was model out a couple of scenarios. One was where you would cover off 50% of the reduction in your revenue, and the other was covering off 90% of the reduction in the revenue. And they gave a couple of different scenarios about how big the legislative stabilization reserve account would have to be if.
Well, I would think it's not just a matter of how much you have to spend, but over what period of time do you have to spend? Because there's shallow downturns that last for a long time. There's a lot of downturns that happen over a period of maybe just a few weeks, and then you pop back again. Sometimes they last for years, so you really never know. So then you'd have to figure out how are you going to budget this money over the long term. And again, I hope cuts come. If you're dipping into the rainy day fund, you should be cutting at the same time so you don't burn through it that fast.
Well, unfortunately, and this came up in some discussions yesterday, we do have some legislators who are calling for tax hikes, and we had one Representative Edwards, and this got repeated a couple of times, and this is a message I give over and over. Look, you in government are having a hard time because revenues have gone down, but so then too is the private sector. The very last thing you should be doing is talking about raising taxes on the private sector, because they're having just as much trouble. Now you're going to punish them and make it worse. What's going to happen with revenue then?
And what kind of taxes are they talking?
Well, one again, it was Mark Jennings. He said he's very, very concerned about this whole notion of an income tax. And in fact, we had Senator Phil Nicholas call in, and he made some comment about, our largest expenditures are in corrections. I don't know if people know this. Corrections, health, and K-12 are the highest spending or the highest cost departments that we have. And it's hard to cut expenses, and we're going to get hit with inflation. And inflation is not tied to any revenue sources. So core sales tax are not tied to minerals, and all that's not tied to inflation. It's the task of the Revenue Committee, he said, was how to prevent this cataclysmic event, such as what's happening now. We need to start looking for other revenue. And all this rigmarole comes out. We need to start looking at other revenue sources. And so what, of course, he's hinting around about is, we need to have an income tax.
Okay, and one of the reasons, and I'm very serious about this, that I am living in the state of Wyoming and not somewhere else is I made the mistake. Florida, where I'm from, doesn't have a state income tax. I moved to North Carolina, state income tax. Well, okay, real smart guy that I am, I then moved to Massachusetts. Okay, so when I came to Wyoming, I said, never again am I going to live in a state that has a state income tax. Now, I don't think I'm the only one. There are people who will leave the state if they start up with an income tax.
Oh, yeah. I got an interesting call from another organization one time, and they said that the amount of charitable giving from private charitable giving in Wyoming went up exponentially in 2014. Do you know why that is? He said. And I said, no, I didn't know. But in fact, it seems like some very, 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 very wealthy people are moving to Wyoming. And one of the reasons they're moving here is because there is no state.
So, okay, some of what we have to cover in the last few minutes that we have here. And what I was telling you during the break, I wanted to touch on this real quick. States that raise their taxes and make it more difficult for people to live there lose population, lose tax base. So apparently we have some legislators that don't understand if they want the tax base to grow, they have to make Wyoming an easier place to live.
Some people just don't get it.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So the money, how much is in the rainy day fund?
Okay, so right now in the rainy day fund, we have $1.8 billion.
Okay.
Now the purpose of this Pew research study, the math study, was to show how volatile the total revenue basket for the state is. And they had done a study before where they showed that Alaska's volatility was the highest. It was 34%. So that means that the revenue varies by up to 34% over the trend line, which is huge. It's huge. Yeah. Just imagine up, down, up, down. In Wyoming, in that study, it showed it was 11.9%. The sort of average was closer to 7%. So let's say, your typical state would be about 7. Wyoming's almost 12. Alaska, by far the highest, 34. So if that's the way the revenue is fluctuating, how big does the rainy day fund have to be? That was what came up. So one of the things that the senators and representatives seemed most interested in was the 90% scenario. So that meant that you would be able to cover off 90% of the fall in revenue over a 10-year period. So how big then does the rainy day fund have to be according to the Pew Foundation? It has to be $3.3 billion. So as Senator Kale Case pointed out, we don't have the money. We don't have the money. We've got this big downturn. And that would only cover us for 10 years.
Yeah.
Is it going to be 10 years? Because the recession that started here back in the mid-'80s actually lasted for 17 years. Right now, what they're talking about at the Joint Appropriations Committee and other legislators is probably about a 6-year downturn.
Right.
So we're looking at least 6 years of slower economic growth, downturn in revenue. Can we really take 1.8 billion and maintain spending where it is now? I don't think so. What we're going to have to see is some real decisive political will about starting to cut. And of course, one of the things that we've talked about before on this show is getting rid of corporate welfare. And that would save hundreds of millions of dollars to the state if they were just to get rid of that one program. And that kind of program is easy to get rid of. It's not like corrections, it's not like health, and it's not like education. Those areas are really difficult to cut. Where we need to start is the low-hanging fruit, and that place is corporate welfare or handouts to businesses.
Okay, and here's where I play devil's advocate. I already know the answer, but everybody needs to hear this. But Maureen, if we have corporate welfare, then what we're doing is we're attracting companies in that are going to bring all sorts of jobs and tax revenue. So why wouldn't we give some welfare to these corporations?
Well, the interesting thing about that is that came up yesterday also in the tax exemption area, and we've talked about that before as well. I mean, there is no evidence to show that those jobs that supposedly come actually come, and then they actually stay. Right. You hear a lot of hoo-ha about, well, you know, we created 12 jobs. Like Microsoft in Cheyenne, for instance, they're going to create maybe 40 jobs. The cost is about $380,000 per job.
Right.
I mean, why don't we just have job creation that doesn't cost us anything and that's actually a plus instead of a minus? It's just the corporate welfare makes no sense.
Are you in favor of giving some corporations a little bit of a tax break if they move to the area? I mean, just to set up and get started?
Well, the thing is, if tax breaks are so great to attract companies, then give everybody a tax break, not just the ones that the legislators seem to think are a good idea, or they make, build big buildings and have great ribbon cutting activities. Let's cut it for everybody, not just those who are favorites. That creates corruption, creates cronyism. It's bad all around for everybody.
Okay, so did you get any good vibes out of this, or did you just walk out throwing up your hands in frustration?
Oh, no. One of the good things about the composition of the Revenue Committee here in Wyoming this year, anyway, is that I don't think there are going to be any new taxes. And all the ones that I talked to, and even some new ones that I spoke to who've heard of me, I seem to be somewhat infamous around the state.
I can't imagine why.
Yeah, they all say, well, I just love what you're writing about the Capitol. I really agree with everything you say. And I think, okay, now that adds up my, if you're starting to count votes, I'm thinking, man, there are going to be no new taxes this session.
But what about, did they deal with the pension at all in this?
Not in this, no.
Okay, because that's got to be part of it ultimately.
And that's a little bit different.
A little bit different?
It's a little bit. It's a separate account, actually.
Separate account, but I still see it as we owe the money, though.
Well, the state technically doesn't owe the money.
Oh.
If that thing crashes, there's no obligation on the part of the treasurer to bail it out. There's no legislative or constitutional obligation. There might be a moral obligation. I mean, think about it. Do you really want to leave an 80-year-old man who spent all his life as a firefighter standing by his mailbox waiting for a check that never comes?
No.
It kind of seems wrong, right?
No.
And I mean, these people have been promised something that the state can't deliver. So what we need to do now, and this is something you could think about doing with the rainy day fund, is looking at doing some reform, because it's not going to be cheap to cut the size of the bureaucracy by 30%. That money has to come from somewhere.
Got to cut you off there. Where do people find your work?
Please go to wyliberty.org or give us a call 307-632-7020.